This year, we spoke to Human Rights Watch's director for Israel and Palestine, Omar Shakir. He was accused of promoting the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, better known as BDS. And as a result, Israel wanted to expel him from the country. We said we'll follow the story closely, and on Tuesday, the country's top court decided to uphold the order for his deportation. Shakir now has a little over 2 weeks to leave the country. Well, let's speak now to the man at the center of the story, Omar Shakir, who joins me from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Omar, are you disappointed? You were hopeful that the Supreme Court would back you. How disappointed are you, I guess?
I'm certainly disappointed, not only because it'll mean that I likely will have to leave the place that's been my home for 2.5 years and not be able to continue doing my job with Israeli and Palestinian partners engaged in the important work of protecting human rights in the context of a 52-year occupation defined by systematic rights abuse, but because of what it means. The Supreme Court has essentially put its stamp on the Netanyahu government's systematic crackdown on human rights advocacy. And this sends a chilling message to other rights advocates. The Israeli government has been saying, and now the Supreme Court has endorsed, a view that says that free speech in Israel does not include the most rudimentary forms of advocacy for Palestinian rights. And that is a message that threatens to not only limit the space for human rights advocates, but really for criticism of any form against the Israeli government.
As we've noted on the show before, as we've experienced on the show before, when you've been a part of panels, Hamas says you're biased. The Israelis say you're biased. What did that tell you about, I guess, the nature of the current situation in Israel and the occupied territories?
And the Palestinian Authority you missed as well.
Oh,
and,
yes, of course. They also said you're biased.
And I used to cover Egypt for Human Rights Watch, and during the Morsi government, we were, anti-brotherhood. During the Sisi government, we're pro-brotherhood. We're pro-Saudi, pro-Qatar. I mean, the easiest way to deal with serious human rights abuses when you've lost the argument is to attack the messenger. It is the playbook 101 of authoritarian governments. And it's unfortunate that the Israeli government, instead of dealing with its serious rights record, has resorted to deporting the messenger, to the credit, I think, of the Palestinian Authority. Despite our hard-hitting reports on systematic arbitrary arrests and torture, our call for the International Criminal Court to consider those allegations, I've continued to be able to meet them and engage with them. And we've had a door to do the same thing with the de facto Hamas authorities in Gaza, but it's been the Israeli government who hasn't allowed us in. I think the goal here is quite simple. It is not only to muzzle Human Rights Watch, but it's actually to isolate Palestinian human rights victims, from access to international human rights groups. They have blocked access to UN special rapporteurs. There's a number of other measures that have been taken against international rights advocates. It's all part of the same collection of repressive policies.
They say you support BDS. Do you support BDS?
Neither Human Rights Watch nor I, as its representative, promote boycotts of Israel. It's that simple. We've never called for a boycott of Israel, a consumer boycott of companies, even companies that do business in settlements. What we do around the world as part of our universal work is we call on companies to respect human rights, as they're obligated to do under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And years of research has led us to conclude that if you're operating in illegal settlements, you're invariably contributing to rights abuse. So we've called on companies like Airbnb to stop doing business in settlements and to respect rights. But that call is distinct from saying boycott Airbnb, much less boycott Israel proper. We're telling a company, like we tell a state, to respect human rights. The fact that the government is throwing out Human Rights Watch for telling companies to respect rights should lead to the question of who will it throw out next.
Right. I've got to wrap the live show. Omar Shakir, pleasure talking to you once again here on the Newsmakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back up to speed with Omar Shakir. Omar, have things changed? Is the BDS label now being used as a weapon to target all criticism beyond Human Rights Watch?
It's undeniable that the situation has changed for the negative when it comes to space for human rights defenders in the last decade. We're probably at the lowest point maybe in the history of Israel. I mean, BDS is one of the tools that's used to deny entry to and delegitimize legitimate criticism and advocacy for Palestinian rights. And that began in 2011 with a law that created a civil cause of action for those that call for boycotts. And it morphed in 2017 to a law that allows the denial of entry, and in my case now, deportation of rights activists. Down the road, it's quite possible it could be the basis for criminal charges. We're seeing in the case of BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti the possibility of revoking his permanent residency. But it's not just BDS. We've seen Israeli advocates labeled as traitors or as engaging in defamation of the state or the army. And of course, Palestinian rights defenders face it the worst. Criminal charges, travel bans. We saw just last week a Palestinian staff member at Amnesty International who was banned from traveling out of the West Bank for undisclosed security reasons. So whether caging in Amnesty or expelling Human Rights Watch, the strategy is quite clear. The objective is to silence criticism of human rights organizations, but those efforts have failed and will continue to fail.
There's some interesting things going on in Israeli society right now, especially as we roll on to possibly a third election. We had a discussion on the show where we had an Arab MK a couple of days ago, a Benny Gantz supporter and a Netanyahu supporter. So what was fascinating is you had the Benny Gantz supporter and the Arab MK completely agreeing that Netanyahu is taking the country down a sort of far-right path. They were calling him an inciter of violence against minorities and full of hate and racism and so on. But when it came to the occupation, suddenly the 2 versus 1 switched around again. So the Arab MK from the joint list was saying, well, the occupation is wrong and we need to end it. And the other two, the Gantz fan and the Netanyahu supporter, both were solidly together. It's not an occupation, and Netanyahu's leading us down the right path when it comes to this. We need to protect ourselves and so on. Do you feel as if when it comes to issues of human rights, particularly with the Palestinians, that the other side, I know there was a Haaretz editorial that came out defending you, saying this was a political deportation, but that sort of voice, do you feel that other side is becoming an ever-shrinking space now in the current Israeli political system?
I think it's undeniable that the political opposition to the occupation has significantly weakened over the course of recent years. The reality is there's an effort to essentially take advocacy for Palestinian rights, and in our case, but it's part of something larger. The efforts to sort of apply universal human rights principles to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which unfortunately the political consensus in Israel continues to support permanent occupation and the significant rights abuses that underlie it. I mean, the other side of this is there is a vibrant human rights community among Israeli groups, and those groups just today, 23 groups issued a joint statement in solidarity with Human Rights Watch. Their work, their research, their findings, their advocacy is closer and closer. We might be at the closest point of Israeli-Palestinian international rights groups having a consensus about the situation on the ground, which is certainly an evolution, but it's also a reflection of the political reality where the room to push, it's not on the top of the election agenda, unfortunately. It's been subsumed by other issues. So ironically enough, my case, I think, goes to the heart of what kind of country Israel wants to be, and whether or not free expression will include advocacy for Palestinian rights. But the Blue and White Party has not spoken out against it, and at the same time that they speak about democratic values, they focus only on the corruption charges against Netanyahu. But being a democracy means more than pursuing corruption. It means equality. It means not ruling over millions of people in a separate and unequal reality of deep discrimination.
Omar, you're an American citizen, right?
Yes.
State Department or any other arms of power in the US, have they said anything, waded in, shown any support?
Look, the U.S. Embassy has attended every one of my court hearings. The State Department has been asked several times on the record about the case. In 2017, the first iteration of things, early in the Trump administration, there was a strong statement regarding the U.S. government's reliance on Human Rights Watch's own reporting. The last State Department Human Rights Report, the chapter on Israel-Palestine, I think quoted Human Rights Watch more than 24 times. The State Department was asked again several months ago, and they spoke of the importance of free speech. Obviously, this is a different U.S. administration, needless to say, on many issues, but in particular when it comes to human rights, and that's not unique to the Israeli-Palestinian context. But, we've seen other expressions of support, including a number of U.S. Congress people who signed a letter of solidarity. And there have been other concerns, especially over the summer when this law was in the news around the denials to Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. So we're hopeful in the days to come, as we hit really the end of the road for this years-long ordeal, that those voices will be louder and louder.
I wonder, do you ever wonder that if your name was, I don't know, Chad Thompson, and you were a white guy from the US, if they would have scrutinized you less, or if this wouldn't have been an issue at all? But to you, maybe they just see you as Omar Shakir, a Palestinian first and foremost, and therefore you must be biased.
So, unfortunately, there have been Vincents and Catherines and others that have been denied entry as well. It's part of a pattern that's larger than just, the Arab Americans. And secondly, I'm actually not Palestinian. My background is Iraqi, and that is noted on page 1 of the government's dossier that I'm an American citizen of Iraqi origin. It's undeniable that the racism of several government officials lies behind this case. But the reality is that the policy has been one that of silencing human rights defenders that has been used not only on those of Arab descent, Palestinians, but Israelis and internationals. So it's a hypothetical, and the last thing I'll say on this is the first iteration of the attempt to block Human Rights Watch access was a denial to the organization as a whole, nothing to do with me, indicating that the attack on me is not something particular to me, but rather is an attempt to muzzle the organization's work. So I think it's an element of what's going on, but I don't think it's the primary one or the most relevant.
You've been given a couple of weeks to leave. So is that it? Are you leaving?
Look, we're going to fight till the last minute of day 20 for me, not only for me to stay, but to safeguard what's left of the remaining space for human rights advocacy. So, we're going to try everything possible. We hope that the government will take the opportunity to take stock of the fact that the world sees this as an attack on the human rights movement. It has a decision to make. Does it want to join the ranks of countries like Cuba, Iran, and North Korea in blocking access to Human Rights Watch staff? So we're going to fight till the end. But at the end of the day, if this decision holds, as it seems quite likely, I will leave. But I'll continue doing the work. We cover other countries in which we don't have access, including Egypt, which I used to cover myself. So we will continue to do that work. We will remain deeply committed to the reality on the ground. And most importantly, we're not going to let any government decide who covers abuses or what issues that we work on. The minute we create a special rule for Israel is the minute that the credibility of our work around the world changes, and Russia and China and Turkey come and demand the same things from us.
Omar, thanks for taking the time again. Omar Shakir, great pleasure, man.
Thank you.